Hi, Bobby, and your class. Thanks for asking me to share some stories from my travels. I want to tell you today about the Nur Hospital for tuberculosis in Marfak, Jordan. Tuberculosis is the world's deadliest infectious disease. More than 1.5 million people die every year from this disease. And among the Bedouins, have you ever heard of the word Bedouin? A Bedouin is someone who is a wanderer, someone who has their family living in a tent, kind of like camping all the time. And they have animals, sheep and goats and camels and cattle, and they travel to find pasture for their animals. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all are patriarchs from the Bible. They were like the Bedouins. They wandered, and they lived like that off the land. But among the Bedouins of the Middle East, they have the highest rate of tuberculosis in the world. And this is the story of how a hospital was raised up by God to care for the tuberculosis patients among the Bedouins of the Middle East. The story starts with a young doctor, a woman that was doing her residency in England, Dr. Eleanor. She was working in a clinic, and in the clinic there were tuberculosis patients, and tuberculosis is from a bacteria that's in the air, and people cough, and if this gets on you or you breathe it in, you can get the virus. You can get the infection. And she contracted tuberculosis when she was working as a young resident doctor, and she almost died from it. And they had to remove one of her lungs, and this experience really changed her life. She began to think a lot about tuberculosis throughout the world and research it. And she found out that in the Middle East, the Bedouins had this very high rate of tuberculosis, and she felt that God wanted her to study further in infectious diseases and in the treatment of tuberculosis and see what she could do as a doctor among the Bedouins of Jordan and of the Middle East. And shortly after, she met a nurse from America. Dr. Eleanor is from England, and she met Nurse Aileen. Nurse Aileen is a friend of mine. She's now 90 years old. Dr. Eleanor passed away a few years ago in a really terrible accident. But I know Nurse Aileen. But when Aileen was a young nurse, she met Dr. Eleanor, and they began to talk about this problem of tuberculosis. Nurse Aileen specialized in infectious diseases as a nurse. And as they talked and prayed together, they felt God giving them this idea to move to Jordan and to have a clinic and help people with tuberculosis. Now, they also, from the very beginning, they wanted to be evangelists. You know what an evangelist is. And even today, all the doctors and nurses that work at the Nur Hospital, and it's a very big operation today, but all those who work there, they have to be evangelists first, and they also have to learn to speak the Arabic language really well, because Dr. Eleanor and Nurse Aileen say we are here to bring the gospel of Jesus to people first, and to help them with their suffering with their tuberculosis also. So Dr. Eleanor and Nurse Aileen got this idea, got this vision from God, and they moved to Amman, Jordan, and started their work. And hospitals in the area heard about their work, so that's how they got their first patients, these Bedouins that would come in from the desert and they were very, very sick and needed help. And they only had a small apartment, and they only had one bed. During the day, they used the bed for a treatment, and at night, they would take turns. So one of them would sleep on it one night with the other one on the floor, and then they rotated night after night. And that's how they were living. They didn't have very much money. They were treating patients either for free. If the patients had some money, they could take it. But that was their work. That was their life. They worked very hard. And they had this vision for a hospital, but they didn't have any money. And that brings us to the next part of the story, which is really a great part of the story. God might use some of you, like in the medical side, like Dr. Eleanor or Nurse Aileen, or God might use you in a different way, like he used this farmer from Nebraska. So there was this farmer from Nebraska that was on vacation, and for his vacation, he went to the Holy Land. Many people take a trip to the Holy Land. They want to see where Jesus was. They want to see all the biblical history. And he was doing that. But when he was there, he felt that he shouldn't just see the history of the place. He felt that God wanted to show him something else, something to do, like with the rest of his life, because his wife had died, his children were grown, and he was just left. And he was looking for something to do, some project. And he heard about Dr. Eleanor and Nurse Aileen, and he went and saw their apartment and their little clinic, and they talked to him and shared their work and what they were doing and the tragedy of all these Bedouins and the tuberculosis problem, and these people don't know Jesus Christ. And that night when he went back to his hotel room, he had a dream. And in the dream, he was in a taxi, and they were driving all over Jordan. Now, the country of Jordan is not very big. You can drive the whole country in a day and a half. But in this dream, he was in the back seat of a taxi, and the driver was just driving all out. And Jordan is all desert, so they're driving all around the desert, and he was looking for something. And this was all in his dream. And then he came upon this piece of land. There was a wall on the front by the street. Then there was a beautiful grove of olive trees, old olive trees that looked a certain way. And in his dream, he knew that that was the land that he was to find. So the next day, he got a taxi. He told the man, just start driving. Drive around the desert. I don't even know where to tell you to go. And all day, and then all day the next day, he's driving with this taxi driver, looking to find what he saw in his dream. And then he saw it. He saw the wall. He saw the olive trees in a certain formation. He knew this was it. And he said to the taxi driver, stop. And he started asking around the neighbors and everything. Finally found out who owned the property. Went to the man. The man said, no, this is not for sale. We don't sell our land here. It's been in my family a long time. But he said, no, I want to buy this land for you. I'll give you a fair price. And then the farmer from Nebraska made an arrangement to buy the land. And he went and told the doctor and the nurse, I found our land. We're going to build our hospital. And they said, well, we don't have any money. We don't even have money for another treatment bed. How can we buy 25 acres of land? And he said, well, that's my part. And he went back to Nebraska and sold his land. He was a corn farmer, and he owned hundreds of acres of land. He sold it to his neighbor. And with that money, he came back to Jordan. He bought the 25 acres. And then for the next 20 years until he died, he was the construction superintendent to start building. They built houses for the staff. They built houses for the families, because to treat tuberculosis, you have to stay for at least 6 months getting antibiotic medicine, sometimes for up to 2 years. So families would come and be with their family and help them. And then they built clinics. And for 20 years, this man invested all of his money in building this newer hospital system. But then there's another, the last part of the story that I want to share with you, which is a great part of the story. It also has to do with money. Because if you go to a newer hospital today, and I go there whenever I go to Jordan, I go a couple times a year, and I know the staff, Nurse Aileen, I talk to her, we have fellowship together and pray together, and I am able to share the Word of God with the staff. And it's a big place now, a beautiful modern hospital. They have emergency room. They have a mobile dental clinic and a mobile tuberculosis clinic that goes out and finds people. It's a great ministry. But it took a lot of money to build what they have now. And what happened is a great story. I'm sure you've all heard of Billy Graham. Billy Graham is a great evangelist. He died a few years ago. He's with God now. Billy Graham had 5 children, and his son Franklin was, when he was in his early 20s, he didn't believe. He didn't believe what his dad and mother believed. He wasn't following Christ. He wasn't believing in the Word of God. He was confused. He was angry. He was rebelling against the things that he had grown up with. And he had a friend, and they had Harley Davidson motorcycles, and they would have them shipped to different parts of the world, and then they would just spend their time out riding around, driving, having fun. He said we did a lot of drugs, we did a lot of bad things during those times. Well, when he was in Jordan, riding around, somehow he heard about Dr. Eleanor and Nurse Eileen and this farmer from Nebraska and what they were doing, building this hospital, this clinic up. And it was still pretty small then, but it was slowly getting built on the property. And they went there, and they really liked it, and it felt good. And they decided, oh, let's just stay here. So for about a year, Franklin Graham and his friend stayed there, and they worked. They worked construction. They were building things and laying concrete and all the things you do to build a place and keep it going. But during that time, Nurse Eileen and Dr. Eleanor, they got close to Franklin Graham. So did this man from Nebraska, the farmer. And they talked to him a lot and listened to him and prayed with him. And he came back to Jesus Christ during that time. And he gave his heart to Christ. And then he returned to the U.S. and he reconciled with his parents because he was not reconciled to them. And then he joined the ministry of his father, and he worked for many years with his father in different ways in the ministry. And then, about 20 years later, he and another man founded a great organization that's called Samaritan's Purse. Maybe you've heard about it. They do this very famous Christmas shoebox fund drive every year, and millions of children get a shoebox from Samaritan's Purse that they organize. And they do many other things all over the world. I travel a lot, and I see what Samaritan's Purse is doing in many lands. It's a great ministry. Matter of fact, you know how much money they get every year in donations? Like when people give money to your church, and then they give it to missionaries, and they do things, and people give money to my charity called Aslan, and we're able to do things. Well, the Samaritan's Purse gets almost $500 million a year in donations, and they do things all over the world. And Franklin Graham is the president of that. Well, after he started Samaritan's Purse and started getting a lot of money in, he knew what he had to do. And one of the biggest projects that they did when they were beginning was to go back to Jordan to the Anur clinic. And they already had the land and they had some buildings, but then they gave the money to build a very big, very nice hospital. And that's the story of the Anur Tuberculosis Sanatorium or Hospital in Marfrak, Jordan. Marfrak is right on the border with Syria. And I think you know that 8 years ago there was a civil war in Syria, and millions of people had to leave Syria, and many of them came to Jordan. And the town of Marfrak went from being about 30,000 people to being 130,000 people And so this hospital has had a great ministry, not only to the Bedouins, but also to Syrian refugees that have come to the area. And that's the story. So God bless you, and hope you have a great lesson today.